100% listener supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
You're back with David Mackey's Shiny Side Out on Revolution Radio, on the #1 listener supported talk radio on the net. So push the donate button or subscribe to the archives for free. That's how much they cost. Nothing. Nada zip zilch. Get yourself some great merchandise from the station's website. Do that. You can get a t-shirt, a mug, or anything. It's got artwork made by A Mad Painter. He's one of the hosts on the station. And I'm going to thank you very much for listening to Revolution Radio. It's a great place. There's so many different voices. I'm sure you'll find something you really like. Jump in the archives and you can download for free our shows. Now, Mecky and I on Shiny Side Out, and we also have Plato's Cave, little cross promotion there. We post our stuff to YouTube as well, in the hope that people outside of listening to this on air and visiting the station online can get exposure to us, to Revolution Radio as well. Very important. And they can message us and talk to us just like this, but it becomes a little history. And since we started doing this because we lost a lot of shows to the deletion gods, whoever they are, and now we've decided what we're going to do is just have it as a secondary archive. Remember the 321 thing, Mackie, the backups, the white paper? You always have 3 copies, 1 on site and 2 off site. Yeah. Anyway, it's pretty cool. Now, this is show number 655. And I can see Mackie's back, but he's muted. And we're continuing the series of 9/11, 23 years on, and this is part 3 in the series. From what I can tell, Mackie, we are on page 22, and this is the unanswered questions surrounding 9/11 by George Grundy. If you want to give some background and lead into it.
Look, it has been a long time, obviously, 23 years since, but recently, and I think I shared it as well with you, Dave, and this was yesterday, in fact. An architect came onto a station in the US on TV with 20 odd years experience in architecture, etc., engineering, and he said, there's still, people out there, architects, engineers for 9/11, truth, that want to know what happened, because he said there's no way for any building to collapse in free fall unless it's planned demolition. And they showed footage of planned demolition on the right hand of the screen. Yeah, side by side. Left hand side was WT7, and WT7 actually fell faster. It was pretty close, but you can't have free fall unless there's nothing giving you any resistance. It's physics. It's the reality of the world. Unfortunately, it's what gives us light speed as the speed limit, and that might not be true. But the point is this: if something is falling right through the atmosphere, the only resistance it encounters is the atmospheric resistance. Okay, and it accelerates up to, I think, 9.87 meters per second. Right? That's terminal velocity. And free fall speeds, obviously you don't reach it in short distances, but free fall speed means that it doesn't encounter any substantial barriers to its fall. Okay, so if something collapses, because if something collapses on something else, there's a little bit of a pause. It goes clunk, right? And then clunk, 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 right? If you can visualize that, it's not a free fall scenario where there's simply no resistance. As soon as you hit resistance, the collapse is slowed down. However little the slowdown might be, but it slows down. It didn't happen here. And this is really why we haven't got any answers. Okay, we haven't got any answers. This is my biggest problem that I have here. We don't have any answers. We were never given any answers, and these are the unanswered questions, really, right? Around 9/11, and we shared some of the questions with you last week from a different article. Okay, and this is another article yet again. So this was by George Grundy, as Dave has pointed out, September 14, 2021. And questions were raised on that day, okay, by firefighters and other first responders. Now let's just quickly go into this, and this is a really interesting article. And to this day, I don't think we have any valid response from any official anywhere as to these questions. Nothing has ever come out. And don't point me to the 9/11 Commission report. That's toilet paper, as far as I'm concerned. Now, while many are quick to debunk 9/11 conspiracy theories, there are aspects of the disaster that seem inconsistent even in the most rational minds, writes George Grundy. Okay. 20 years ago, which was, of course, when he wrote this from 9/11, I thought, the author, I could write a nuanced retrospective on the worst terrorist attack in history without focusing on the contradictions and inconsistencies that plague the story. I couldn't do it. I'm not alone. Just last month, Spike Lee was to re-edit his new documentary series on New York and 9/11. HBO didn't like the final episode, which featured interviews with scientists who publicly voiced doubts that the Twin Towers were destroyed solely by fires caused by aircraft impacts. Spike Lee's highly Oscar-winning feature is still not acceptable to even hint at questioning any aspect of the events of 9/11. In 2021 and in 2024, this is Matthew speaking, that remains beyond the pale. Now let's be very clear. Asking the content creator to change content is called censorship. Right? So if Spike Lee was asked to re-edit his documentary and take out certain things, that's censorship. Many of the issues with 9/11 aren't in any way in dispute. It's the contention of the book here, 2017 book, Death of a Nation, that the towers fell because of explosives and that the Pentagon was hit by a commercial plane. But if that's too much for you, there's plenty of other material. Last week, US President Joe Biden, again this is 2021, ordered the release of previous files from the investigation into the 9/11 attacks, many of them detailing connections between the Saudi government and the hijackers. We know that there were substantial contacts between Saudi spies and the 9/11 hijackers, 15 of whom were Saudis. One Saudi spy named Omar al-Bayoumi met two future hijackers off Los Angeles, England in 2000, arranged for them to be put up in a flat for which he signed the lease and paid the rent, and regularly checked in on them. Why was the Saudi government official paying the rent of two 9/11 hijackers? Biden might be opening a can of worms here. To expose further links between the Saudi government and the hijackers might strengthen already plausible claims that the Saudis were deeply implicated in the events of 9/11. So the geopolitical implications of Biden's move can't be overstated, given what we already know. And by America's own definitions, Saudi Arabia should probably be designated a state sponsor of terror. And good luck with that. Equally worrying, from an establishment point of view, we'll be putting the spotlight back on the extensive links between the Bush family, the House of Saud, and the Bin Laden family. These were so pervasive that the Bin Ladens had investments in a firm called the Carlyle Group, on whose board George H.W. Bush sat. Extraordinarily, as the attacks on 9/11 commenced, Osama bin Laden's brother, Shafiq bin Laden, was at a Carlyle business conference that the father of America's president had attended the previous day. The degrees of separation between these two preeminent oil families are not great, Dave.
Then there are the hijackers themselves, mostly Saudis, mostly with poor spoken English, almost all exhibiting behaviour entirely unbecoming of pious jihadists prepared to give their lives for Islam. The pilots themselves seemed almost comically unqualified. Hani Hajur, who was said to have carried out a brilliant technical maneuver in piloting a commercial plane into the side of the Pentagon, was unable to control a single-engine Cessna 172 just a few months before 9/11. An Arizona flight school manager who dealt with Honduras said he could not fly at all. Unquote. Cocaine, alcohol, gambling, strippers. Dreadful flying records. These were very unusual Muslim fundamentalists who somehow pulled off a daring raid with military precision. There was a fifth plane due to have been hijacked on the morning of 9/11. Flight United 23 was delayed on the tarmac, so missed the crucial airborne commencement of the attacks, and was returned to the terminal instead of taking off. During the taxi back, a number of Middle Eastern men in first class became agitated and fled the moment they disembarked. The two pilots had already taken steps to protect the cockpit. Both have impeccable professional credentials, so the story really isn't in doubt. Somehow this part of 9/11 has just faded from view. As Air Force One flew back from Florida to Washington, Vice President Richard Cheney, we know him as Dick Cheney, told George W. Bush that a threat had been made to the plane, one that contained a top-secret code word, and was thus being assessed as highly credible. The pilot of Air Force One, Colonel Mark Tillman, was told of the threat, and an armed guard was posted on the door of the cockpit. This threat was instrumental in Bush being kept on an itinerant journey across America until nightfall of September 11. But it has never been fully explained how, at that precise moment of the attacks, someone with access to top secret codes made a credible threat on the life of the president. While many of us remember the horror of the September 11 attacks, the story of why it happened and America's reaction is a fascinating history lesson. The streets of New York were awash with TV news crews on 9/11, many of them interviewing people on their harrowing experiences at the World Trade Center. There was a peculiar symmetry to the tales. Firefighters, NYPD reporters, and civilians repeatedly said that there had been secondary explosions going off throughout the towers prior to their collapse. At least 118 witnesses' reports spoke of these explosions, yet broad raft of testimony has been ignored by history. Today, it appears to be unacceptable even to reference what was widely broadcast on network television that day. A third building fell in New York on 9/11, Tower 7, or WTC 7, of the World Trade Center was 47 stories high and fell some 7 hours after the spectacular plane attacks. I'm just reading what the author's written. Strangely, the building's collapse was announced on several TV networks minutes before it happened. I remember that BBC live cross they did to a reporter and who had already said that the building had collapsed. The building's collapse was announced on... the building fell suddenly at freefall speed in such a straight line downward that almost all the rubble collected in the footprint of the building. Officially, the building fell because of fires ignited by the earlier attacks, but this makes it the only internal steel-framed building in history to collapse because of fire. This too has faded from view. The Zogby poll in 2006 found that nearly half of all Americans weren't even aware that a third building had fallen on 9/11. There's much more. War games, including ones that normally took place at other times of the year, but in 2001, all centered on that day, September 11th. Confused air traffic controllers who responded to hijackings by saying, "Is this real world or exercise?" There was an inaction by those at the top of government, including Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, the two most senior defense civilians in America, who saw the second plane attack but concluded, to quote Wolfowitz, "There didn't seem to be much to do about it immediately, and we went on." And with a meeting, he was implying. A 9/11 commission that is now routinely referenced as a template for how to deal with this year's 6th of January insurrection, but was set up to fail according to its leaders. Largely forgotten anthrax attacks, I remember those, white powder found in little bags being mailed everywhere, that kept America in a state of post 9/11 terror, but took 7 years to explain and were finally blamed on a dead man. Mackie.
None of this is controversial. It's barely in dispute. Extraordinary, often seemingly inexplicable things happened on or around 9/11, and that's without getting into potentially more controversial aspects of the day, many of which are credibly supported by readily available information. For some reason, it's okay to suggest that the Bush administration routinely lied about Saddam's weapon of mass destruction and was extraordinarily deceptive and belligerent in many of its actions after 9/11. But to question what happened that day makes you a tin head wearing lunatic whose voice simply can't be tolerated. That's us, by the way, Dave, because you wondered.
Oh, yes, that's right.
On January 6th,
yes.
this year, which is again, 2021, another attack in America took place. Although the casualties were a mere fraction of those on 9/11, the insurrection this year perhaps equaled 9/11's threat to American democracy. Rioters at the Capitol missed encountering senior political leaders by mere seconds, and news was set up by an armed mob chanting death threats to the vice president. 2 pipe bombs miraculously failed to explode, and a truck was found loaded to the hilt with weapons and Molotov cocktails. Once again, an attack in America took place under a Republican president, whose party is now overtly anti-democratic. This time, the threat undoubtedly came from within. The pipe bombs were designed to go off just as the Capitol attacks were taking place. Donald Trump openly encouraged supporters to riot. It may not be long before we can definitely say that America's government attacked itself. Children born on 9/11 are now 20, or in our case 23. To young people, 9/11 may seem like a distant historic event. Yet, the effect of the attacks that day is still felt in those who grieve, the first responders whose health still suffers, in the politics of Iraq, and on the streets of Afghanistan. It's still there in America's sprawling military-industrial complex. Its 250,000 staff Department of Homeland Security. I didn't know that's many. Jesus, that's a lot. In the world's airport security systems, and in the West, domestic spy networks as they collect everyone's communication, ostensibly to keep us safe from another devastating attack. 9/11 is the one event when everyone remembers where they were. The attacks were an abomination, an immense human tragedy whose political effects are still felt today, a generation on. But they're not beyond question, and you can be a very ordinary person and still believe that there's more to answer on the subject. Now, this was published in the independentaustralia.net. And he also wrote a book, George Grundy, Death of a Nation, 9/11, The Rise of Fascism in America. So, this was 3 years ago. There has been no discussion of any of this that I've seen anywhere, apart from, like I said, this architect came forward in a recent clipping.
I know that they've been from the beginning. There's a groundswell of architects and engineers against 9/11. Questioning
because
the narrative. And it makes sense because their intent is purely to design buildings that won't fall down.
There you go. And the explanation of this building falling down, or these buildings, I should say, 3 of them, it just doesn't hold any water. It's just, you see, Hitler was right. Goebbels and Hitler said, the bigger the lie, the more likely people will believe it. And if you repeat the lie often enough, it eventually becomes the truth.
That's right.
And look where we are. I mean, some of the perpetrators, in my opinion, have died already, right? So some people are beyond judgment on this, right? But ultimately, we have to look at this and say, and the reason we have to do this, this particular event is because it so profoundly affected the world and politics ever since. We have to look and say what actually happened. What happened?
Yeah.
We have to come clean. I mean, we all know now that the Nazis, or the German Nazi Party, burned down the Reichstag, which led to the emergency laws that Hitler used to get into power.
Of course.
That we know this now. If Hitler had won the war, we would still think the communists had burned.
That's right.
Okay.
And why is that?
I'm sorry, but
it's because the winners write history.
Bingo. And Dave, in fact, the first hour, Dave made very good points around this. I saw this fantastic little quote. If the media reports we see, the news clippings, the internet news, the TV news, radio news, if those are all fabrications, or at worst or at best, I guess, very selected pieces of information that we're allowed to know, what about history? Right? Yeah. And I know this is going to sound crazy, but I mean, they are complete, and we spoke about this, Dave, and we're going to bring a show on this as well, right? There are entire civilizations that we don't know about in history at all. Zero. Nothing anymore. And we only know about them from, I guess, the omission, as well as the people that vanquished them. That's right. That's it. Like Neanderthals. I know this is taking a long draw, but Neanderthals exist in our genetic material. They do. But everything we know about Neanderthals comes from things we dig up. And while we do carry some Neanderthal DNA, I wouldn't say we're all pure Neanderthals, right? We're not, because our DNA is mixed. But the Neanderthals, they can't speak for themselves because they're no longer here. Is it possible that Homo sapiens killed off its brothers this way? Possibly, yes. Sure. Carthage, I mentioned before. All we know about it comes from Rome. There's other civilizations like that. And there was this Chinese emperor who decided history starts with him and burned all books.
That's right.
Library of Alexandria. I know it's a bit of a myth and maybe even not entirely true, but apparently when it was conquered, the conqueror said, well, either the books agree with the Quran, in which case the Quran is enough, or they don't, in which case we need to burn them. So off they went. Now the Catholic Church used a very similar logic in South America, and to some extent in Africa, but mostly in South America, where there were libraries of books. Libraries! And these were advanced civilizations in South America, right? These were people living in caves and straw huts. These were people that built massive irrigation systems, network of cities. Like it's a whole civilization. Yeah. It's completely destroyed now. But the Catholic Church said, well, if it doesn't agree with the Bible, then clearly it's some form of heresy or blasphemy, or even worse yet, some kind of devil worship, right? So we're going to burn it, or it agrees, in which case the Bible is enough. So it's all good. So let's burn it all. It is this willful destruction of the past that has led us to where we are, where we have no idea. And I refuse to let the information die. I refuse. As long as this radio show exists and Dave and I do it, we will come back to this. Not every day, but we will come back to this. Until either we are no longer here, or the questions have been answered, right? But really answered, not just some kind of nonsense 9/11 Commission report that answered nothing. Nothing. I mean, if
don't make me tap the sign again, Mackie.
Yeah. But look, it is really upsetting that after all this time, 20 years, right? We're no closer to, and not. There's no public discussion. It's like everybody has agreed. It's like, you know, all the news outlets. I mean, they're owned by only a few people, so that we don't need that many people to agree on this. By the way,
Mm-hmm.
They've all agreed that this is no longer a topic that should be discussed. Nobody's really interested in this anyway, right? Well,
That's
what
right.
should be interested?
See,
Makes no sense.
You're coming on board.
I'm boarding, baby. I got my boarding pass and everything.
That's right. You can't sit in the co-pilot seat anymore. So you know.
You can't.
No. So Becky, I wanted to mention this, and it's coming up, I know, but the plane crash in the field had no bags, and it was the exact same location of a previous, to the centimeter, to the inch, of a previous plane crash, and it was only a divot.
What are the odds, Dave?
Well, it's pretty high. So, and there were no baggage, there was no plane wreckage, and the grass was spray painted black. Because when you burn, I'm just going to let everyone know, if you burn grass in a field, it's gone. There isn't any grass left, but you could still see the grass moving around in the wind, but now it was just painted black. Extraordinary stuff. You know, wow, that's some real good special effects there. And so look, I'm gonna take this. So 9/11 for Dummies, the top 5, count them 5. Becky and I will take them alternatively. 9/11 facts everyone should know, and I'll take the first one. Number 1, the World Trade Center Building 7. Why did it fall? This 47-story building fell on the same day as the Twin Towers, yet it was never hit by a plane. There was a small fire which the cause never fully explained. Then in the early evening it collapsed. The video of the collapse shows it going straight down. The 9/11 Commission does not have much to say about this collapse, and the mainstream media never mentions it. No plane hit the building, period. Why did it collapse? How? Has the red flag been raised? Yes, by many, yet the general public is amazingly unaware. Thus, this fact may go down and get lost in time.
Which it kind of has by now, right?
It kind of has,
yeah. 2, the Pentagon. In fact, there are no plane debris at the Pentagon. Witnesses at the scene who were in the building and had to crawl during the chaos report no sightings of any plane debris, no cockpit, engines, seats, nothing. Worse, the Pentagon is the most secure building in the world, and in 2001, that would mean hundreds of cameras on full-time recording events outside the building. Not only by the Pentagon itself, but by the myriad of buildings around the Pentagon, yet not one video of a plane flying extremely low and hitting the building. Not one exists, not one. All we have is an explosion and hole with no evidence of a plane hitting the building. These are the facts. Worse, professional pilots, including ex-Air Force pilots, report there's no way they could have flown that plane that low at that alleged speed and hit the building. Yet the 9/11 Commission says it was an Arab pilot who could hardly fly Cessna, who did the deed. Finally, the only evidence that we do have of a plane that was hijacked comes from a phone call from Barbara Olson to her husband, Theodore Olson. Barbara Olson was a Republican conservative employee of Fox News, and her husband, Theodore Ted, was a member of the Bush administration as United States Solicitor General from 2001 to 2004. In legal terms, these people are not exactly at arm's length, and under cross-examination would be deemed biased, not credible witnesses, yet these two are the only connection we have to a plane hitting the Pentagon. Before I let this one go, just one other thing to remember. There's such a thing as flight dynamics and aerodynamic design of planes, and a terrible little thing called lift. If you are flying a large plane and coming in hot, fast, right, and all that wonderful stuff, you can maintain a certain airspeed, and but you would shake quite violently. The closer you get to the ground, though, this is important to understand. The closer you get to the ground, the less lift you have. Okay, because there's simply less air under your wing. Okay, so to fly at any distance at that low an altitude is, in my mind, an almost impossible feat, because there's not enough energy or atmosphere, I should say, to generate the lift that you need to stay airborne, right? And apparently this was extremely low flying. So how that would work from a physical point of view, I'm not entirely sure. Sorry, Dave. Tell us about the next one.
Oh, okay. So this is the Shanksville one. There is no evidence that a plane, it's number 3, that a plane hit the ground. There is just a burned dirt and shrubbery. A shrubbery! The first videos from the scene are no longer available, and so we're left with what the government says about this thing. According to the Shanksville mayor, Ernie Stahl, there was no plane. He told German television in March 2003. He said, "My sister and a good friend of mine were the first ones there," Stahl said. They were standing on a street corner in Shanksville talking. Their car was nearby, so they were the first here. And the fire department came. Everyone was puzzled because the call had been that a plane had crashed, but there was no plane. There are family members of those on the plane that said they received calls, including the infamous "Let's roll" line yelled by one of the passengers, but where are the bodies? No bodies, no recovery of seats, no engines, nothing, no luggage. I'm adding to that, but yes, that's completely right. The original witnesses on the original footage said it looked like a missile.
Yes.
It didn't look like a plane.
And this is really strange, because the thing is this, right? Let's say there weren't any planes, and there's no contention around all the planes, by the way. But even if you have only contention around one plane, for argument's sake, or maybe let's talk about Shanksville and Pentagon. Let's say those weren't planes, because those are the most highly contested, right?
Yeah.
But potentially others. The other planes may not have been planes, but let's just focus on those two. My question then becomes, where are the passengers?
Uh-huh.
Now, if
that's
were
like
planes,
MH370, Mekki. If it landed in the British Indian Ocean territory, where are the passengers?
Where are the passengers? Were they deemed expendable? Now, the thing is this, right? People balk at the idea that anyone in the government could ever expend their own citizens this way, right? Execute them, bury them in a mass grave. Now, this is hilarious to me because I'm a student of history, and nothing. There's nothing they would rather do than that. That's probably their favorite thing they do. It's my hobby. They will tell you. I'll hurt 3 citizens before breakfast. Otherwise I can't eat my eggs. It's really
think about all
shocking
the wars in a world where we lost 30 million people.
Yeah.
And they were governments sending those people to war.
Exactly. Into harm's way. So every day there's a war, and there's a war every day. A government or several governments decide to send their own people into harm's way, or put other people into harm's way by bombing them, etc., which is what we're seeing now catastrophically unfold, of course, in Lebanon. No one talks about Gaza anymore, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed that. But it's really, it boggles my mind that people are still so naive and would say, our government would never do that. Absolutely they would do that. They're not your government. They're not for you. They're not looking out for you. If they happen to look out for you, it's a side effect. It's a happy circumstance. Okay? Not because they want to. It's just coincidence. You're benefiting here as well. Oh, great, good for you. I'll tell you. And that's where we are. I find it, but where are these people, right? This is really were they just killed out of hand? Is that what happened? And who was on these planes? And was there any benefit? And usually when these things happen, there's a benefit for people disappearing, right? So because with 9/11, there's so many people benefiting from it, it boggles the mind yet again, right? Which brings me to one of the biggest benefactors, which was, of course, the WTC towers, the two towers, right? Planes and the collapse. At 8:46 a.m., the government says 5 hijackers crashed American Airlines Flight 11 into World Trade Center's North Tower. This is one World Trade Center, okay? And at 9:03, some 20-odd minutes later, another 5 hijackers crashed United Airlines Flight 175 into the South Tower, 2 World Trade Center. Average Joe Blow witnesses, so Joe Block and Jane Average, on the ground say they saw planes hit the building, and clearly from the video evidence from both mainstream media and some amateurs on the ground, we do see planes hit the buildings. But the plane markings are not clear, and thus we are not sure if those planes were in fact the planes that the government said were flights, or the flights in Flight 11 as well as Flight 175, right? What we do know is that Larry Silverstein procured the lease for the WTC in July of 2001, July, and won the bid despite being outbid by a rival. And it just so happens Larry Silverstein also had the lease on Building 7. Another thing here, which is not part of the text, is that
he insured them.
Yeah, which would pay out double in case of terrorist attack. Okay, double, and it was $1 billion in each building. Now, I've said this before years ago, and I'll say it again here because it fits right here. I had a friend I used to work with, and we no longer work together, but he told me a story of a friend of his who lived and worked, or who probably still lives and works in New York, and he was at the time he was doing waiting jobs, I guess like for a catering company, whatever, and he happened to be a waiter on Larry Silverstein's boat after 9/11, and he overheard that Larry said that it all went very nicely, very smoothly, and the whole operation went off without any hitches, and they they pulled off the controlled demolitions and things to that effect. Right now, my work friend has no reason to lie to me. And in fact, he told me this before I had this show, before Dave and I had this show.
Yeah, wow.
Before the show was ever conceived, he told me this story because he knew I was interested in these kinds of things. Right? He said, "Oh, I actually got a friend who worked on the Larry Silverstein boat." I said, "Okay, really? What happened?" And this is what happened, but you can't mention any names. Oh, I don't want to mention any names. That's all good. And I go, "Oh, wow, really?" He goes, "Yeah, that's what he told me." So it's not firsthand. It's not a first-hand account. I didn't hear it. Right?
That's right.
My friend didn't hear it, but my friend's friend heard it. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's the absolute, foolproof truth. However, it is certainly another nugget of information that is interesting.
It needs to be verified, but we're not going to have that ability. So take it as you feel. So you still there, Mickey?
I'm here, which brings us to the perpetrators.
Yes. According to the government, the leader of the 9/11 attack was former CIA agent Osama bin Laden, and the mastermind operations manager was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. They said they were 19 hijackers involved in the attacks, and the government-sponsored 9/11 Commission concluded so. As anyone who understands crime investigations knows, one must follow the evidence. And the evidence says a lot that the government does not say. First, the alleged evildoers are dead and their Al-Qaeda organization is decimated. More, they don't appear to have benefited or benefits from the attacks except notoriety. Who did benefit from the attacks were the war profiteers and anti-civil liberties groups. In the days after 9/11, the government waged 2 major wars and reduced the American public from a once free society to complete controlled corporate fascism, says the author. In the wars, trillions of dollars were made. The evidence is everywhere. The global beneficiaries are everywhere in plain sight, while the American peoples are saddled with a broken economy, no relative freedom, and a bleak future.
Again, what happened that changed the course of history for the world? Not just for America, because a lot of other countries followed suit, especially in the West, and certainly here in Australia, which introduced similar legislation. When it comes to, investigative powers, arrest powers, holding powers, especially holding powers, by the way. They might as well throw away the key once they've got you. As soon as someone says terrorism in any of the charges against you, it's all over, brother.
That's right.
It's all over. Because at that point, you might there's the law that existed prior to 9/11 no longer applies to you, which I find amusing. And it's really something that has come about very fast, but without any resistance. Zero. In fact, it was welcomed by people. And this is really the modus operandi that these folk have been following now for the longest time, where they create a problem, right? Now, if this sounds familiar, David Icke has been saying this for years as well. They create a problem. They let the people come and say, oh, help, please do something, Mr. Big Government or whoever, right? And then conveniently, the government offers a solution. Oh, here it is. There it is. Now, what happened after 9/11, obviously, it was the largest terrorist attack on American soil, full stop, right? I mean, because Pearl Harbor was not a terrorist attack. Pearl Harbor was an act of war. And Al-Qaeda is not a nation, so you can't really declare war on an organization per se. Right?
No, ideal, yeah.
Yeah, you can't. It's not possible. But so it's a terrorist act. Biggest by far, bigger than Oklahoma City, bigger than anything else that had happened with the most casualties. And they needed a decisive outcome, and they needed to strike back. And look, George Bush was. He wasn't a great president. Did he win the election? Well, many will say no, he didn't. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court ruled he did. Most of the people in the Supreme Court were put there by his father and other conservative administration, like Reagan, for example. Like there was a fairly large contingent of conservative judges even then on the Supreme Court, and they ruled in favor of Bush rather than Al Gore. So you can argue that he was not a fully endorsed president. So he was off to a bad start. It didn't get much better. In fact, this inauguration, they were running because there was such a protest against him in the streets of Washington. Go back to the footage; it's quite amusing to watch. And he became a bit of a laughing stock. That all changed after 9/11, and I need you to remember this history. He became very decisive. He had a very clear message because it was a simple message, right? He wasn't very good at complex policies and strategies and general global politics. That wasn't really him. Okay, but he could
enjoy
be very decisive.
Good children's story.
He sure did. I can't get that image of him out of my head. He sits there in the classroom on the little baby chairs, and the guy comes, whispers in his ears, and you can see him sort of, nodding pensively, and goes right back to reading the story with the kids. But this is another thing that I find completely inexplicable. There are protocols in place for these kinds of scenarios. That's why we have a Secret Service. I mean, what's the point otherwise, right, of the Secret Service? As soon as there is even the hint of a potential organized or
event, a significant event, right?
Yeah. So I mean, one plane into the World Trade Center, you go, oh well, what a terrible accident. Two,
not an accident.
Attack on the Pentagon. All of a sudden, it becomes a situation where you have to hustle the president out of there.
Yeah.
He didn't want to scare the kids. Let me tell you what, they wouldn't give a hoot about scaring the kids. They hustled. The leader of the free world needs to be hustled out, or this is what I like to think, because I think it's hilarious. He was seen as expendable. You know, he was like the moron son of a pretty, you know, right-wing president. His father is not a moron. Let me be very clear here.
No.
And it was really Cheney and Rumsfeld.
CIA, right?
Oh, completely, absolutely. He was president. He was vice president. He had been in Washington for decades. And let's be clear here as well. It was Rumsfeld and Cheney who really ran the administration. I mean, really, right? And yeah, especially Cheney as the vice president. Was he expendable? Maybe, but what the Secret Service should have done, and it's completely irrelevant that he was with kids or reading a book or whatever. As soon as there's a credible threat of any kind, you hustle the president out. That's what you do. Okay? And later on, apparently there was a credible threat, you know, that they were aware of on his life. But the message was simple: let's get the evildoers. Like, this is almost baby talk. Axis of evil, evildoers. We will hunt them down. Blah blah blah. It took decades. Well, maybe not decades, but it took years and years to find and kill Osama bin Laden. He wasn't in Afghanistan when they found him. Okay. Most of the hijackers were Saudis. He was a Saudi. I mean, nobody ever investigated the links. Nobody ever investigated why the bin Laden family was allowed to fly. This reminds me of this little nugget of information I've shared with you before. The day before, there was an attempt on Ronald Reagan's life by Hinckley. I can't remember his first name, but Hinckley, you know, was the person that tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan. Failed, of course. The day before, and I remember George Bush Sr. was vice president. Okay, Reagan was president. Bush Sr. was vice president. Important to remember. I think it was the brother, or the cousin. I think it was the brother. The brother of Hinckley was at the Bush compound for a barbecue. I mean, at some point you have to call a spade a spade. I'm sorry. Yeah, you can no longer think in these terms of as coincidences. What? It's what did he do there? And Hinckley, you know, the Reagan shooting. It boggles the mind. John Hinckley was his name, John Hinckley Jr. Well, I mean, he of course, obviously he didn't succeed. But if he had succeeded, George Bush Sr. would have become president. Is there a pattern here? I don't know. All I know is that there are things that don't make any sense, and there are just too many coincidences lining up. Yeah. So
totally.
You make of it what you want. You make of it what you want, but I know what I believe. So, and yeah, his brother. I'm just going to find out if it was his brother or not. But why would that be? You know, I mean, it reminds me also. It also reminds me of the Port Arthur shooting in many ways, right? Which was, in my opinion, you know, another thing that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if he was such a great shot, yeah, Martin Bryan, that is, and the way he could, like, his kill to wounded ratio was something that an assassin would be proud of. I mean, you know,
kills around, yeah,
in a professional, yeah, in a professional sense, right? I'm not endorsing it, but no, as far as professionalism is concerned, you think, oh man, that's a professional who knows what he's doing. And then he's cornered by the police, same Martin Bryan, and lets off hundreds of rounds and doesn't hit a thing.
That's right.
Doesn't hit a thing. I don't.
So Mackie, I wanted to focus back on George W. Bush, and I typed in our chat the Bushism that I like the most, and that at a conference, one of those paper seat conferences, where he's one of the speakers, he said that the French don't have a word for entrepreneur, and that has stuck with me forever. It shows his level of education. He's not a scholar, and certainly not a scholar of the English language. He doesn't realize that word is French, which is really funny. To me, that's hilarious. I have a hard time with, out of X amount of hundreds of millions of people we have, as the US has, that these are the people that get to the top. It still astounds me today. I just don't understand how the system has been made for them to be the leaders. It's astounding. It really is. And I know we can make as many jokes in hindsight as we like, and yes, there was trouble on the day, and he did want to find out what happened to that kid's story about whatever happened. It was the goat or the horse or the pony, whatever it was. Yeah. And so it's concerning that what we do know about the event on that day, what was actually happening in parallel from a training exercise perspective. I remember seeing, Mackie, it's all gone now, you can't find it, but there was a person that had done a walkthrough, I think the day before, and they had all these human-size people cutouts, like cardboard cutouts, with a piece of wood holding them so they're standing upright, in the unoccupied floors of the building.
Really?
I think, yeah, WTC 1 or 2, I don't remember which it was. There was a relative of the Bush family who was the security, headed up security in the months prior. There were teams of French examiners or something signed in who they could have been installing, they could have, I don't know, who knows. But the idea on the internet was that the boxes, the wording on the boxes that they'd carried in and were taking parts from were the shape charges. It's all hearsay, right? The explosions people heard could have simply been elevators falling to the floor, falling to the basement. They could have been. Not saying it was. I just don't know. It's great to talk about it and to bring to life again those discussions that we'd had on the first day leading through the first 10 years of it. Now we're 23 years on, and how much has faded, which is the point of the last story that we talked about. Because I remember watching the Pentagon, like for all the live footage, I'm watching the Pentagon and the light towers, the towers that hold the lights for the park area around, weren't broken. And originally there was just a small hole. Just a small hole. And none of the window panes were broken in the Pentagon. Then teams came with huge bags. These bags were enormous. You could have like a 10-foot ladder in these bags. These were all black bags, all delivered by trucks. And these people walked up and grabbed the bags and walked around the site and put up like shields, like you would do if someone was severely injured by the road, and the police would put up like a thing just so you don't see it. And then when they brought them down, there was debris and the bags were empty. it was clear what was happening. It was clear to me watching it that this seemed to be kind of made up. It didn't make any sense when I was watching it. Why is there such a small hole? Then the fire consumed it and the whole piece fell down onto it, collapsed. Just the facade collapsed. But, you know, that chevron of the Pentagon had just undergone an upgrade. And was this a test? Was it purely a test to see what would happen if a missile hit it? Was it their own people? Was it just written into the greater plan because, well, why not? We'll do it on the same day. I don't know. And I asked the question because I truly don't know. But you know what, Meccy? That's the end of the second hour, where you can catch Meccy and I, Plato's Cave, 7 a.m. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, Eastern US time, and catch us again next weekend for Shiny Side Out. But in the meantime, Meccy, what are our listeners to do?
Be safe.